We've been working on installing a 650 horsepower supercharged 6.2-liter direct-injected LT4 V8 engine into a slick Pro-Touring 69 Camaro here at the V8 Speed and Resto shop, along with all the required upgrades for the fuel, cooling, clutch, and other systems as required. Our team removed the less than street-friendly big block Chevy V8 engine and fabricated a custom firewall and a dry sump oil system to accommodate the new LT4. The supercharger inherently adds heat to the intake air charge by compressing the air, but it also has an air-to-water integral air charge cooler. At this point, the team is working on plumbing the air charge cooler along with the engine cooling system and vintage air AC system.
Anybody who's read up on LT4s, especially in Corvette trim, know that they have an overheating problem. The overheating problem is got some issues. Some of it's oil temperature, some of it's supercharger, and how much the supercharger is being driven. The blower is actually pretty small on this. It's something like 1.4 liters, I think, which is smaller than the old LS9 blower was, which was 2.3. So from the factory, GM's spinning this blower a lot harder, which generates a lot more heat to start with. Well, you start cranking it up, you're going to generate even more heat.
The engine oil itself leaves the engine, goes to a tank, also goes to a cooler, and then back through the engine and into the storage tank. The supercharger coolant leaves the engine and goes through a heat exchanger and then back through the supercharger to keep that cool. There's also AC lines, heater, core lines, and there's also power steering hoses that had to be plumbed in as well. This car happens to have a Detroit Speed rack and pinion setup.
The supercharger sits on top of the engine and features a built-in cooling system which relies on circulating liquid coolant through the charge cooler and flowing to the front of the car through a CNR heat exchanger unit. We've been using their products for quite a while. In fact, we helped them kind of come up with a design for a radiator we used in a 69 Camaro called Loose Change several years ago. But today things are pretty different. This radiator is the direct result of their involvement with Formula One racing. These guys don't mess around when it comes to cooling products. In Formula One, the teams wanted to increase the cooling system pressure to be able to run higher temperatures but still keep control of the cooling system. Most radiator caps are only rated 16 or 18 pounds per square inch before they release. This radiator design is designed to withstand 100 psi, right? So the way they did this and what they found to be different is that typically on an aluminum radiator, you've got tubes that go across from tank to tank. That's these horizontal lines. And the typical tube design was a rolled type tube. So flat material was rolled and then welded and then installed in this core, which works very well except for the fact that they're very thin wall and they're not very strong. So as that pressure rises, the tubes can actually balloon, and when they do, they're risking not only bursting, but they start to reduce the airflow around them, so they reduce the cooling effect as well. So in this case, CNR came up with an extruded aluminum tube design, and they sent us this demo cutaway radiator. You can see down here on the side, you've got these very small but very thick-walled tubes that go across. And these are far stronger than your typical rolled and welded tube, allowing this thing to achieve a much higher pressure. Now, we're not saying that we're going to run 100 psi of pressure in this particular car, but it's good to know that this thing will handle that kind of pressure and still be strong enough to withstand bursting. They did a few other things to increase the overall strength as well. At each corner, they added a reinforcement tab between the core and the tanks. And the reason for that is even though the radiator gets mounted in the car, you have hoses attached to it and hard lines and fans, and plus the car is moving, right? So the whole front suspension is articulating, and maybe there's some flex that gets transmitted through the car into the radiator. Well, that twisting, coupled with the heat cycling of hot and cold, sometimes causes the core to separate from the tank, and that can cause leaks. We've seen lots of aftermarket aluminum radiators that start to leak for no expected reason. They just pinhole little leaks here and there. And it's not because the product was bad, it's because they are subjected to all these stresses and different forces against them. So by adding those reinforcement tabs, they've strengthened the whole thing. The back side of the radiator has kind of an open air fan shroud design and a pair of Spall fans. And the other thing you'll notice from the back angle is how many cooling fins there are per inch. C&R believes that a highly dense amount of cooling fins allows for better thermal transfer between those fins and the air rushing through. So again, that's designed to increase the cooling capacity on this radiator. The 69 Camaro's radiator core support is fitted with the radiator, vintage air condenser core, and Spall cooling fans to help this beast keep its cool.
Along with a bigger C&R intercooler, we also added methanol injection.
And that consists of a supercharger hat that has solenoids installed on it, and then lines 8 injectors.
Which, when you spray that raw water and alcohol in the intake, it evaporates and soaks up a bunch of heat. That way we don't have a problem with detonation. And since the system in this car is really smart, we don't have a problem with it pulling back boost and timing because it's seeing intake temperatures that are too high.
We sent the housing to Nitrous Express, where they plumbed in the nozzles and hard lines, and then our team fabricated a stainless steel alcohol reservoir. We were clearly out of space under the hood, so this tank lives in the rear trunk of the car.
So the way the methanol injection works is there's a boost reference line that we pulled off the supercharger and ran to a little control box. And the control box monitors boost and progressively increases the amount of methanol that's being sprayed versus the amount of boost putting onto it. And that's adjustable with a potentiometer on the box, so you can dial in as much or as little as you need to keep the car happy.
These engines rely on a sophisticated engine management system, which translates to a new wiring harness and engine control module.
The main engine harness is pretty large in diameter, and what we did was we ran it in through the passenger floorboard, and it makes a really tight loop, and that was kind of hard to conquer that transition up into the dash without trying to force everything out of the way, if you will.
In this case, there's not a lot of aftermarket options available for a Gen 5 engine yet, so we use the GM Performance Connect and Cruise harness and ECM kit. It's no different than wiring up any other Connect and Cruise kit. You got your basic powers, grounds, ignition, and fuel pump wiring. There is a fuel pump control module in this, but it's all terminated and there's just 3 leads you run all the way to the back of the car. In this particular case, we didn't cut the harness up at all. We mounted the fuel pump controller on the cowl box on the driver's side, because that's basically where the wires landed for it. The fuse box we put inside the passenger fender where the wires would allow it to reach. And the ECM we actually mounted above the glove box, which is a place we've used in first generation Camaros before, because there's quite a bit of dead space up there. So it was relatively simple to put the massive ECM up in that space. So the ECM that's in the car has got a crate motor calibration that GM developed, which is basically what comes in a brand new Corvette with some things removed that the Corvette would have had. This car doesn't, like emissions controls and body modules and that sort of stuff. As far as interfacing with it and tuning it, it's OBD2 protocol, so we're able to get into it with HP tuners and make changes for our pulley swap and headers and cold air intake that we put on it.
The exhaust is handled by a set of black ceramic-coated stainless Ultimate headers and features a sharp-looking collar on the flange. They dump into 3-inch stainless exhaust that runs under the car with an X-pipe, through some Borla mufflers, and then out the back of the car over the rear suspension. This engine was a takeout from another vehicle and had arrived painted black, but we wanted it to match the car, so our painter Jeff spent some time detailing out the supercharger hat and adding some red accents between the ribs. Once the paint was dry, the paint was removed from the ribs, giving us a factory appearance just in a color scheme that matched our Camaro. It's been a pretty long road, but next, our Camaro runs and takes to the streets, putting all that new power to the pavement.